Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for being here. My name is Amy Gawad. I'm the program director with the Johns Hopkins Urban Health Institute, and I would like to welcome you all and thank you for joining us for this evening's Skolnik Lecture. We have had the privilege of co-sponsoring this event with the Maryland Family Network for many years, and we also have the privilege and honor of having Margaret Williams serve as our community co-chair for the Urban Health Institute's Community University Coordinating Council. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Urban Health Institute, we serve as a bridge between Johns Hopkins and the East Baltimore community. Through our events and activities, we aim to support and strengthen community-university partnerships and collaborations that aim to improve the health and well-being of the residents of Baltimore. I wanted to briefly take this opportunity to share with you an event that we have coming up on November 20th at 4 p.m. Antero Patella, who's a veteran journalist and author, who will be discussing his new book entitled The Ghosts of Johns Hopkins, which not only examines the life and legacy of Johns Hopkins, but also discusses how the institutions he founded shaped the racial legacy of Baltimore. We'd love to see you all there, and we have some materials back in the back that will share with you how to register for this event and to learn about upcoming events that we have as well. So with that, it is now my pleasure to welcome Brian Ekes, who's the Senior Vice President for Global Finance at Legg Mason and a member of the Maryland Family Network's Board of Directors. Brian.
Hi, good evening. As Amy said, my name is Brian Ekes, and I'm on the board of Maryland Family Network. On behalf of my fellow board members who are here tonight and the many Maryland Family Network staff who are tonight, welcome to the 9th annual Sandra J. Skolnik Lecture. This is the only event that brings to Baltimore great thinkers whose ideas have an impact on early care and education policy. We look forward this year to learning more about Dr. Reeves' research and insights on income inequality. Maryland Family Network focuses on the youngest children because 90% of brain development happens in the first 5 years. 90%. So if we put that in context, if you think about a 75-year lifespan, those first 5 years are only 7% of your life. If you think about it a different way, 7% of a day is 100 minutes. So if you only had 100 minutes of each day to impact 90% of the rest of your day, just think how differently you would approach those 100 minutes and how jealously you would guard and care for those 100 minutes to make sure the remainder of the day was as successful as it could be. Maryland Family Network ensures young children have strong families, quality learning environments, and champions for their interests, all of which are critical for young children to succeed. This lecture series was named to honor the legacy of Sandra Skolnik, a visionary leader and champion for young children, their families, and other caregivers. It's my pleasure to introduce to you someone who knew Sandy well and continues to carry on her legacy, Margaret Williams, Executive Director of Maryland Family Network.
Okay, I'm back. Before I introduce our speaker, it's my pleasure to recognize a few folks who are with us tonight, especially my esteemed board members, Barbara Andrews, Lisa Benson, Reggie Cohen, Brian Ekes, whom you just met, Judy Fry-Jones, Elaine Hedelman, Joanne Hampson. So thank you all. I know you're all here, and I'm so grateful that you made the time and effort to come. And also, a special thank you to the 3 staff people who spent a lot of time putting this all together, Doug Lent, Josh Davidson, and Warren Jones. And finally, we have some of our funders of Maryland Family Network here, who I just want to mention. From the ABLE Foundation, we have Bob Embry. From the Baltimore Community Foundation, Shanesha Sauls. From Maryland State Department of Education, Jen Nizer, and from the United Way of Central Maryland, Franklin Baker. Now it is my very great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Richard Reeves. He comes to us from the Brookings Institute, where he is a senior fellow in economic studies and director of the Future of the Middle Class Initiative, and co-director of the Center on Children and Families. His research focuses on the middle class, inequality, and social mobility. Dr. Reeves' latest book, which is really what triggered our request of him to come here tonight, is called Dream Hoarders: How the American Upper Middle Class is Leaving Everyone Else in the Dust, Why That's a Problem, and What We Can Do About It. If you read the book and you like it, you'll be very glad to know that there are other publications well worth reading, including Time for Justice, Tackling Race Inequalities in Health and Housing, Ulysses Goes to Washington, Political Myopia and Policy Commitment Devices, and The Parenting Gap. Dr. Reeves is also the author of John Stuart Mill, Victorian Firebrand, which will appeal to the economists in the crowd. He is also a contributor to The Atlantic, National Affairs, Democracy Journal, Wall Street Journal, the New York Times. In September of 2017, Politico magazine named our speaker one of the top 50 thinkers in the United States for his work on class and inequality. He is a member of the Government of Canada's Ministerial Advisory Committee on Poverty and also teaches at the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University. Dr. Reeves' previous roles include Director of Demos, the London-based political think tank, Director of Futures at the Work Foundation, Principal Policy Advisor to the Minister of Welfare Reform, Social Affairs Editor of The Observer, Research Fellow at the Institute for Public Policy Research, Economics Correspondent for The Guardian, and a researcher at the Institute of Psychiatry at the University of London. He holds a BA from Oxford University and a PhD from Warwick University. We are so delighted to have this distinguished thinker who's done some wonderful writing on issues of such importance to our country and to the world. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming the 9th Sandra J. Skolnik Lecture Series speaker, Dr. Reeves. I'm going to take the long way.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you for that gracious introduction, and let me say what an honor it is to be here and to thank the co-sponsors of the event and all of those who've worked so hard to put this event together. I'll start, as well as the thanks, I have to start with some apologies. The first apology I have to make is that I spend a good deal of my time talking about the problems of class and inequality in America with this accent. The astute observers among you will have realized already that I'm not a Baltimore native. From the UK, and in fact my last job was working in the coalition government in the UK. And in part the book is inspired by a comparison between the class system of the UK, which I hated and railed against and fought against for much of my life, including my professional life, and the class system that I discovered on my arrival in the US, which I've come to believe is more ruthlessly effective than the one I left behind, but that it's less obviously effective because it does so under a veneer of classlessness, the idea of meritocracy, the idea that in America, if you just work hard and pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you can make it. At least in the UK, nobody wears T-shirts saying future queen or future king because we know. And so I know a little bit of what I speak. And it was partly the sort of tragedy of discovering that brought me to write the book. So part of my defense is I know a bit about class, where I come from. The second part of my defense is that whilst I remain a UK citizen, I became a US citizen in 2016. In fact, I became a US citizen in the very last citizenship ceremony in this state that took place on the very last day that you could register to vote in the presidential election. So I was one of 53 people from 47 different nations who took the oath of allegiance. Every single one of us then proceeded to walk over to the Women's League of Voters in order to register to vote. And it's a great thing, anyone who hasn't been to it, to also a great nation, a nation that applauds that is still something to be cherished. In the UK, you say you become a UK citizen, people go, huh? So what? And actually, one of the modest proposals I made recently out of Brookings was, I don't think it would be a bad idea if every American high schooler attended a citizenship ceremony. there's something quite profound about it. Hands up here who's been to or participated in a citizenship ceremony. That's a good number. It's a higher proportion than in the general population, but I kind of think it should be part of civics. It's pretty hard to leave a ceremony and not feel moved by it. As I say, so I'm now a Maryland native. And the other thing is that although I'm not from Baltimore, my wife actually grew up just north of Baltimore and spent many of her most important years here, including working at the Columbus Center on the harbor and some formative years at Chase Brexton, the health clinic, which many of you will know. And we had dinner last night with one of her closest friends, Dr. Joseph O'Neill, who was the medical director of that center during some of the most difficult years of the struggle against AIDS and HIV. And our godchildren still live in Baltimore, so I'm a sort of very, very extended native, if you'll let me take a few steps. The other apology I'm going to make is that there will be a few charts in my presentation. A few graphs. I know it's the evening, but I know no one really likes charts, really. Well, some people do. Hands up who likes charts. Hands up. Amazing. Amazing. Good work. Good. I guess you knew what you were getting, right? I'm a Brookings scholar. I don't travel anywhere without charts. I use charts to answer the question, how did your day go? And I say, what do you want? Mean, median, moving average? It's not a simple question. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of early years in the structure of my work. My work is focused on inequality and social mobility. It's focused on the inheritance of inequality. It's focused on the idea of birth as destiny. It is focused on the very thing that America is supposed to be against, although has failed in various different and really very important ways to live up to that promise. So in a sense, what I'm trying to do is loosen the coefficients, loosen the correlation between the inequality or poverty of one generation and of the next. That's a particular way to think about social justice and fairness and equality, and it's the way that I mostly think about it. And it's really thinking in this very long intergenerational terms. And I think that's one of the reasons... Does that move on its own? Does this happen at every lecture? Am I being hazed right now?
It's interfering with this side.
Excellent. Just So I am going to talk a bit about early years, partly because the transmission of inequality does take place from the very beginning, indeed before the beginning of family life. And so I'm going to talk about that going forward. But as I say, one of the reasons I wrote the book is this kind of moment of recognizing the class system in the US. And there's a bad reason why you don't talk much about class here. We don't talk much about class, and that's this idea of classlessness and meritocracy I've referred to. The good reason is that racial inequalities remain so deep, so enduring, so structural in the US, that that's the predominant way which we'll typically think about inequality in the US, and quite right too, except that race and class, of course, are intersecting in very interesting and powerful ways now, and that a conversation about race doesn't just preclude a conversation about class. In my view, it requires a view about class too, not least because of the way class categories can be used in the US as exclusionary categories as well as inclusionary ones. Sometimes it feels as if you only have to say working class to have signified white. When people talk about the problem of the working class now, very often that carries a very strong racial connotation too. And so those different kinds of inequality do come together in interesting ways. But the purpose of this particular book, as opposed to some of the other book, was to focus specifically on this issue of class, and particularly to really have a go at the upper middle class. The people in the top 20%, 10% of the US income distribution who have convinced themselves that they're not doing very well, when really by any particular measure we're doing really very well indeed. And we're leaving most of the rest of Americans behind and then wondering why they're cross. So I'm going to start with a story about this man. Now, the audience is mixed age. There's a few young people in the audience, I see. So just in case, this is Barack Obama, 44th President of the United States. It does feel like a long time ago, doesn't it? It's not really that long time ago, but I think there are different kinds of years. There are dog years, human years, and Trump years. Whatever you think about what's going on, whether you're a supporter or not, it's just something about time is just moving real slow. It feels like an eon ago. It feels like a generation ago. It feels like JFK almost, how long ago it was. But anyway, notwithstanding how long ago it feels, it wasn't that long ago. And actually something that happened to President Obama is what inspired me to write the book, and then subsequent op-ed pieces and so on. So I'm going to tell that story. I'm going to tell it, as they say in Hollywood, based on true events. He's flying on this plane, Air Force One. He's flying from India to Saudi Arabia as part of a delegation. With him is Nancy Pelosi. who you will all know is the minority leader for the Democrats. And she got a call from this man, Chris Van Hollen, who you also may know. My congressman at the time, now, of course, our junior senator for the state. And Chris is worried about something. He's worried about a particular provision in the tax proposal that the president has just made. The president has just launched his tax bill. There's a particular idea in there. Chris is worried about it. His constituents, place where I live, in Bethesda, Chevy Chase, Maryland, highly affluent, liberal area, really not happy about this. He calls Nancy and says, we need to talk to the president, and we need to get this idea killed. She says, I'm getting the same responses from my constituents. I agree. I will talk to the president. I happen to be on Air Force One, so I'll just wander down the corridor and knock on the door. Hello, come in. Who is it? Hi, it's Nancy. Hi, Nancy, what is it? What's on your mind? Well, it's this tax idea. I've just got off the phone with Chris. We've got to kill it. He and I agree. It's a terrible idea. You must kill it. Fine. I will discuss it with my senior advisors for a while. Goes back to the office on the plane, calls the White House and says, kill the idea. The very next day, the idea is killed. I'm not going to play the video, but this is from the press conference the next day, which was to expunge from the his proposed tax reform a proposed reform to something called a 529 college savings account. Hands up who knows what a 529 college savings account is. Again, a very high number, a much higher number than would be in a representative sample of the US population. So 529, actually, well, who really knows what a 529 account is? Who can explain what it is? You look like you know what it is. Gentleman there with the beard, yeah.
It's a way to put money aside for your children or grandchildren's education so it is not taxed at the time that you invest.
Correct. And when do you think it was introduced? And under what kind of president?
Oh, it sounds like a good Republican idea.
Right.
So
Yeah. Yeah, well, it was a Republican idea. It was vetoed by Bill Clinton, passed by George Bush, and you're exactly right. It's a tax-free savings device. You put money in, and it's exempt from capital gains tax when you take it out to pay for college expenses. It's also basically immune from gift tax, so you can superfund if you want. You can put in a lot of money, which would otherwise attract gift tax. In fact, the Obamas put $250,000 in a single year for their daughters to avoid gift tax rules on taxation. And in many states, including Maryland, you also get a state tax deduction. So there's the federal tax deduction on capital gains, and then there's the state tax deduction, which can be set against your Maryland income tax. So in Maryland right now, the regulations allow you to save $2,500 a year for each child, for each person paying in, can put in $2,500. So my wife and I have 2 kids. We can put in between us $10,000 a year and set that against our Maryland income tax. We're top-rate Maryland income taxpayers, so even with the SALT deductions, that's saving us $500, $600 a year for saving money towards our kids' education. And to avoid the capital gains tax that might come down the line. I'll tell you what I do with that money later if we get into the Q&A, because I'm fiercely critical of this tax deduction that I myself then claim. But it's it sort of feels unpatriotic not to take a tax deduction in the US, doesn't it? I think the most liberal, I've tested this with my most liberal friends, including the most liberal economists, who rail against these tax deductions. They all claim them. I think the kind of question is, what do you then do? So, as I say, it was vetoed. And so the proposal was to change the tax structure. This is the distributional consequence of 529 accounts. The data's pretty old, but it's all we've got now. And this chart's just showing you by income quartile. So the poorest 25% of the population on the left to the richest 25% of the population on the right. And the 2 bars show you, the left-hand bar, the dark bar, shows you percentage of households in that income group who have a 529 account. And then the right-hand bar, the light blue bar, tells you of those who have an account, what's the average balance in that account. So what it's telling you is the only people who have serious numbers, and this is all households, not just with children who have it, are those who are in the top quartile of the income distribution. That's well into 6 figures, household income. And the average balance is pretty healthy, $30,000. As you go higher up the income distribution, it gets higher. This makes perfect economic sense because you're not going to pay capital gains tax unless you have a decent income anyway. The thing is that only people with money have the money to save money. So it's the affluent who can afford to save anyway going forward. And so it's baked in. It's probably the most regressive element of the tax code. And so what President Obama proposed to do is basically, going forward, take away the tax deduction and instead use it for tax credit, which would be spread much more fairly. This is on paper clearly an outrageous policy, but it was killed. It was the only element of his tax proposal that was taken out, and it was killed not under pressure from Republicans. It was killed under pressure from Democrats. It was killed under pressure from Nancy Pelosi and Chris Van Hollen. So at somewhere along the way, a Republican tax cut, which is the most regressive element of the tax code, became beloved of the liberal upper middle class living in the Pelosi and Van Hollen areas. That's where the emails were. That was the moment I decided I had to write my book. This is what Paul Walden said at the Post and the Times, which is the proposal was targeted at the single most dangerous constituency to anger, the upper middle class. Wealthy enough to have influence and numerous enough to be a significant voting bloc. This wasn't specific, it was going to hit the 1% and the top 0.1% as well, but it's really going to hit the top 15%, maybe even 20%. There's a lot of us. And we form a majority in some of those kind of liberal, affluent neighborhoods where are represented those people. And so we come to see it as an entitlement. And that sense of entitlement that I saw around the debate about our 529s, you'll see it also mortgage interest deductions, etc., really struck me. And it struck me as a very deep problem. And that the deep problem is that there is a class of Americans well beyond the plutocrats in Wall Street who are affluent and doing quite well, but have managed to convince themselves they're not, and have developed something of a sense of entitlement around how well they're doing. And that has become a very big obstacle to bring about the kinds of changes I think we need to bring about to restore something approaching equality of opportunity and get closer to the American dream. We have to tackle upper middle class self-interest if we are to do more good for everybody else. It's not just enough to give, we are also going to have to give up. We will have to give up some stuff. And that's a very much harder political ask, of course, as we saw from this event. By the way, in the Republican tax bill that was just passed, 529 accounts were extended so that they can now be used not only for college savings, but also for private K-12 education. So anybody even if you weren't using 529s to save for college, if your kids are in a private school and you're not using a 529 account, you need a new accountant. It's literally insane not to do it. Even better in New York, where you don't have to put the money in, 529, you just have to have one. In Virginia, you have to leave it in for 5 days. You can take it out again. So hence this book, now available in a few bookshops. Also as an audio book. They decided to turn it into an audio, which was nice, but I said, I'll read it. And they said, well, you'll have to audition. You have to audition for the part of reading your own book. I passed, thank God. Can you imagine what it would be like to fail the audition, to be yourself? Anyway, sorry. So it's me reading it, not some actor. They were going to get some actor to read it. I said, well, who else will read it? They said, we'll get an actor. I said, we'll have to be someone British, because I write about being British. Yeah, we'll hire a British actor. Or I could do it. Anyway, I'm going to go. This is the argument of the book, and I'm going to talk a little bit about early years as I go through this. Early years is an area where I have done some work, although it wasn't the focus of the book. It does, one of the policy recommendations is significant investments in certain early years programs, in particular home visiting programs. I'm a very, very big fan of early years home visiting programs, which we can get into perhaps in Q&A. But here's my basic message. The upper middle class, that's who I mean by that, separating from the majority. That inequality endures from one generation to the next. It's being handed on. There's an inheritance of that inequality, and more so now than in the past. And there are two ways that happens. One, through what I call market meritocracy, which is essentially just kind of getting your kids so skilled, so full of human capital by the time they hit the labor market, they're almost bound to succeed. So it's not necessarily that employers are discriminating in favor of those from upper middle class backgrounds. It's just that they are so better qualified and so more highly skilled that a straightforwardly meritocratic test will mean that they will succeed. And that's why the upper middle class are so obsessed about education and why we lost it over our 529 accounts. Because we've come to see the possession of an expensive college education as critical to maintaining our status and their status in the upper middle class. So we have to start early, because if you're going to interrupt that, the earlier you start, the better. And then the second is a bit of cheating, what I call opportunity hoarding, which is where we rig some of the markets in our favor too. And fundamentally, this is a problem of culture and solving the problem that I started with, which is the sense among the American upper middle class that they're not rich. It's always somebody else that's rich. And that's a huge problem to bring about the kinds of changes we want. I need to be reminded too when you want me to stop talking, because I can go for like a day if necessary, or 10 minutes. Just give me a reminder of roughly when you want me to stop. Right, okay, fine. No, we'll take a vote. So if you're starting to flag, put your hand up, and then once we get more than, say, 30% of people with their hands up, I'll stop. Does that seem fair? So first, this kind of issue about inequality. Who's heard of the idea of inequality being we are the 99% or the 1% or Occupy Wall Street? Hands up who's heard that framing of inequality. Yeah, everyone's. That's became quite a predominant frame for the way you think about inequality. And although there's some truth in it, I think it's very far from the whole truth. And I came to dislike it quite profoundly. It's one of the things I attack in the book. But it's not only income. There's separation along all of these lines, not all of which I'll get to today, of course. In fact, most of them I won't touch today. But it's just, I want to note just in passing that you can measure inequality in lots of different dimensions, whether it's income, wealth, health, housing, neighborhood, social capital, and so on. And most of those inequalities are widening, not all. But more interesting to me, they're becoming more tightly related to each other. So wealth inequality is now more tightly connected to income inequality. Differences in family stability are more tightly connected to income inequality. So what you're seeing is the more tight clustering of different kinds of inequality. So in other words, the people who are doing well on one dimension are increasingly doing well on the other dimensions too, and vice versa. So you're seeing the multi-dimensionality of inequality. And so part of the job, I think, is to try and break open those clusters so that being low income doesn't so strongly predict being in poor health, for example, and vice versa. But I obviously won't go through all of these today. Now, in fairness to the Occupy Wall Street, Bernie Sanders framing, this is a we are the 99% chart. This shows you real income growth on average for each of the groups shown in the chart. The top 1% is that line at the top. That's them. They're the people that we marched against. The line below is the 19% below them, which is where I am, and where some of you will be. I'll give you the income brackets in a moment. Then the 40% below them, then the 40% below them. So you've got the bottom 99% of the population is in those bottom three lines, okay? So you look at that chart and you think, yeah, actually, if you're in that sort of 19%, you might feel as if you are bumping along with everybody else. So put some numbers on this. To get into the top 1% now, you need a household income, pre-tax, of well into 450,000. You've got to be kind of knocking on the door of $500,000 a year income to get into the top 1% now. To get into the top 20%, to 19% below, it's closer to about 140,000 household income. 140,000 will tip you into that kind of top 20%. Now, a lot of people say that doesn't seem like very much, but that usually just tells me more about where our relative measures have gone, and sometimes where people live, to be fair. And then you'll see what's happened to the people below. Now, so that is I'm going to march to that chart. But social scientists, as those social scientists in the room will know, do their dirty work in various places. We do it with our choice of inflation. Sometimes we do it with our years, and we very often do it with our left-hand axis. So the left-hand axis here, because it includes top 1%, has to go up to 2 million. If you push the left-hand axis up to 2 million, it has the inevitable effect of flattening down everybody else. So let's take them out entirely. This is the chart without the top 1%. Same data, take the 1% out. Bottom 40% at the bottom, next 40%, and then the 19% above them, which is where I am, defined as the upper middle class. The median income of that group is $200,000, a bit more than $200,000 a year, household income. That's what's happening to their real income over time since '79. Now, I give you that it's not as exciting a chart as the other one, right? You can make a real exciting chart with that left-hand axis. But there's a whole heck of a lot more people in there. And the basic story is that whilst you have seen this pulling away of the top 1%, you're also seeing a pulling away of the 19% below them, where I am, where the upper middle class are, which is then reflected in all these other kinds of inequality too. There has been no increase in income inequality in the bottom 80% of the US distribution. None. The bottom 80% of the US distribution looks pretty much the same today as it did 30 years ago, 35 years ago, right? It's not that the middle are pulling away from it's not that the poor are falling behind the middle. It's that the bottom 80% are where they were. And actually, there hasn't even been that much real income growth, as you can see, for that bottom 80%. It's that everybody else is pulling away, right? And as I said, I could show you the same charts for all kinds of things: marriage, wealth, housing, neighborhoods, social capital, you name it. And it'll show the same sort of pattern for most of those things. This kind of pulling away of this class, who I call the upper middle class, this top 20%. They don't call themselves that, usually, but that's who they are. This is just showing you the wage gap as well to make the point. It's just for men. You get a similar pattern for women, which is just showing you the gap between the bottom and the top, which is the top line, and then the bottom and the middle and the bottom in there. All that tells you is that the gap has not grown between low-paid workers and middle-class workers. The gap has grown between top-paid workers and everybody else. That's the story we need to get, is that the majority are being left behind. and that those at the top are pulling away. But it also goes across generations. So you see this kind of stickiness across generations. You'll see intergenerational stickiness at the top and at the bottom. Some of these charts take a little bit of unpacking, and we produce them at Brookings. So this is an intergenerational income transition matrix. We make them all day. Fantastic. Our days fly by. I'm not going to unpack it for you. There are better versions of it on Raj Chetty's website. But the basic kind of message here is just that people will very often intergenerationally are more likely to get stuck at the bottom if their parents were poor, using quintiles, and to get stuck at the top if their parents were rich. So there's this intergenerational transmission of stickiness. That's all I want to take away the chart. I won't unpack it, is that the poverty of one generation predicts the poverty of the next generation to a significant degree and higher in the US than everywhere else. However, big differences by race. I won't go through all the charts now, but in the US, there's a very, very stark differences for black Americans in particular, and for black boys in particular. We now know that a big part of the story of lack of upward mobility in the US is explained by the peculiarly low, by international standards, upward mobility of black boys, especially for those from low-income households. It's true of wealth too. Wealth is even stickier, more inherited than income. And you see increasingly in the data now the evidence that place is part of the story. So typically we would have thought of households, families, etc., schools, what's going on there. But the evidence is growing, not least because of the work of Raj Chetty and his colleagues at what's now called Opportunity Insights at Harvard. And I'll show you one map from their new work in a moment. And I consult with them to declare an interest. Is that place matters a lot, at a really quite granular level. So in their earlier work, and they use anonymized tax data to show this, they looked at what was the causal effect on earnings of people growing up in various places. So I just pulled the data for Baltimore City. And what this is showing you that on the left-hand axis is the percentage impact on your earnings as an adult compared to what they would have been given everything else we know about you. And what you see is that for all, the line in the middle is showing you that growing up in Baltimore, controlling for everything else, had this downward effect on adult earnings. But the effect on girls was zero, statistically speaking. All of the effect was on boys. So there appears to be no causal place effect in Baltimore on the outcomes for girls, but a very strong place effect on the outcomes for boys, who are up to 27% poorer in terms of their earnings as a result of growing up in Baltimore. Now, what the data doesn't allow us to do is say, why is that? What is it that's driving that? But that's where things get interesting and where you can get more granular. But I simply put that up for the purposes of kind of giving you a local illustration of how place really matters, but it also very often matters differently on gender lines, and it certainly very often matters differently on race lines too. You'll all know the racial composition of Baltimore City. So this downward kind of pull is being dominated by the outcomes particularly for African-American boys. You even go in a very small scale. If you haven't seen this already, it was on the front cover of the Times 2 days ago. There's now a new data set where Raj Chetty and his team have linked tax data to census tract data. And this is just a screenshot, but you can pull it up and you can basically zoom into every census tract in the US. Decide who you're interested in and see what the outcomes are. So here I've shown what the outcomes are. So it's very hard to see on here. It's for illustrative purposes anyway. What the outcomes are for low-income black boys from these different census tracts in Baltimore. And you can also zoom in, you can zoom out. And where it gets more interesting for me is less that you see. And so red is worse and blue is better, right? According to their median earnings as adults. So, and you can choose your outcome measure. You can play with this all day. It's very interesting. You do Hispanic, you can do white, you can do black, you can do it with different income levels. But where it gets interesting is you'll see like a couple of census tracts, for example, where they're really very different outcomes, even though they're right next door to each other. And economically, they don't look that dissimilar. And so that really then starts asking some quite hard questions of us, which is like, what is happening there? And when is it happening? And with the evolution of big data applied at this small scale, you can really start to have a much more interesting conversation about who needs the most help, where, and when. Because you can also see at what point in the life stage people seem to be struggling the most. So this is an advert to go to Opportunity Insights, look at the Explorer, and for everybody involved in these conversations to really dig in. It's a fantastic data, it's literally just 2 days old. The first way in which we see this inequality being inherited, so we've seen all that, and of course I should say that as places get more segregated, place is also a more important policy area of policy debate, because whilst the US is a little bit less racially segregated than it was in terms of neighborhood, still very high by international standards, as I have to keep reminding a lot of Americans, and mostly because of the rise in the Hispanic population. Still a little bit of a drop in racial segregation, but a rise in economic segregation. So our neighborhoods are somewhat less segregated along racial lines in the US, but they're somewhat more segregated along economic lines. So if you live in an affluent neighborhood, you are slightly more likely to have a neighbor of a different color to you, but you're less likely to have someone of a different class. So if you're white and your neighbor's black, then that's much more likely now than it was before, but there's a decent chance that they're a lawyer or the equivalent. And what you're not going to have is someone from a different class background. And we'll get into that a bit. This just shows you the same intergenerational stickiness chart, and now I'm just showing it for education, because education is so important. The 46% there tells you, I use father's education for this because women's education has risen so quickly, but sons and daughters' outcomes. What it tells you is if a child is raised in a household whose father is in the top rung of the education ladder, they've got 46% chance of being on the top rung of the education ladder themselves, when in a pure meritocracy it would be 20%. So educational status seems to be even more strongly inherited than income and wealth, although of course they're all highly correlated. Now, let's start with some good news. I'm sorry the chart got a bit messed up here at the bottom. I'll just explain it anyway. Again, this is from Raj Chetty's work. The grey line is showing you the relationship between the parents' income, whole population from 0 to 100, so the whole parents' distribution along the bottom, and then the child's distribution along the left-hand axis. And the grey line just tells you there's a correlation between how rich your parents were and how rich you end up being, right? Strong, straightforward, simple correlation. The two lines above that, the people at the top are those who went to elite four-year colleges, and the ones below that who went to any four-year college. I could also put on 2-year, and that's just another line slightly below. What this chart's telling me is two things. One, the fact that the line is high tells me that people who went to those colleges, especially the elites, do well. They're higher up the distribution on the left-hand axis, right? No, I'm not telling you anything you don't know. The earnings of people who go to four-year colleges are much higher, and if you go into elites, higher still. What's much more interesting is that it's almost flat. The fact that it's almost flat tells me that conditional on going to one of those colleges, your income background barely matters at all to your outcome. So people are very fond of saying there's no such thing as a kind of silver bullet, but it looks as if actually completing four-year college gets pretty close to it. It gets pretty close to wiping away that correlation between where you start from and where you are. That's great news. Education is the great equalizer. Now for the bad news. This chart shows you, by parental income along the bottom, from the poorest on the left to the richest on the right, the percentage chances of enrolling in college between the ages of 18 and 21 for the child. So, conditional on your parents' income, what are your chances of going to college between 18 and 20? Now, it doesn't include mature students. 18 to 21 is a particular age group, but nonetheless. You know how sometimes social scientists put up a scatter plot? Have you ever seen this, where they put up like lots of dots, and they put a line of best fit through it, they put a regression line through it, and they say, look, and it's statistically significantly correlated. And you look at it and you're squinting and you're going, really? Oh, well, they know what they're doing, I suppose. They're an economist. They've got some squiggly thing I don't understand, and there's an R. I never really knew what that was. Well, they've done it here too. So the grey dots the blue dots are the actual data points. The red line is the line of best fit, which as a courtesy they've put on there for us too, but I think you'll agree that you don't need it. This is simultaneously, because it's based on anonymized tax records, linked across generations, and based on, because we know who goes to college from the tax records, this is simultaneously one of the most elegant and terrifying charts I have encountered in the last 5 years of looking at social science. The correlation coefficient on this is 0.67. What that means is I can predict your chances between the ages of 18 and 21 of enrolling in college just by knowing your parents' position on the income distribution. That's all I have to know. That is an incredibly high correlation coefficient. 0.67. There is nothing that gets close to it. Knowing your GPA doesn't help me as much as that. Knowing your SAT score doesn't help me as much as that. Just tell me how much money your parents have got, and I'll tell you whether you're heading off to college by the age of 21, with 0.67 accuracy. So in theory, wow, what a great equalizer. In practice, none of the poor kids go. And so by the time you get to post-secondary education, by the time you get there, the die is almost cast. The machine is already working. Those of us who've been able to work the machine are ensuring that our kids are up there and that they are going to those, the others are getting locked out. Then you can see of those who go, which kinds of colleges do they go to, again using Chetty data. Now I'm looking at the bottom 40% of the distribution, the middle 40, and the top 20. And what you can see is for top 20, for us, for the upper middle class, I'm talking about me now, the modal place is a selective 4-year with a good chunk of elites and Ivies too. But modal is selective 4-year. That is not true for everybody else. The modal institution of those who go in the bottom 80% is community college, 2-year community college. But you wouldn't think that from the debate about higher education in the US, would you? That's the modal institution. It's a modal institution for the middle 60. If they go from that background, they're going to 2 years or maybe public access 4 years. But you wouldn't think it from all the debates about should Georgetown PhD students get a tax waiver on their tuition or not. I don't care. Now, of course, the universities themselves will say, well, what can we do? By the time they get to us, we're just being meritocratic. We use GPAs, SAT scores, we're trying, but this is College Board data, poorest on the left, richest on the right, again, using their income buckets, not mine, with average SAT scores by income bracket. So you're a selective institution of any kind. You just say, look, we're not biased against poor kids, but we have high academic standards. And so we just take people with SAT scores of above X and then wonder why the composition of those institutions is the way I just showed you. So we apply a meritocratic test to entry to so many educational institutions, including in some cases K-12 institutions too. And under the veneer of being meritocratic, in the sense of, well, it's just whoever did best on the test, we replicate inequality. We stratify by class, and we give an automatic advantage to those who come from a background that allowed them to prepare. Right. And so this very idea of meritocracy, this kind of mythical idea of meritocracy, is now a positive impediment. This is a change for me to think about this, a positive impediment to progress and real equality of opportunity. So this is what happens by the time you're applying, and that's why we have to start early, which I'll get into in a moment. And I never tire of reminding people that the word meritocracy was coined by a British sociologist called Michael Young 60 years ago. In 1958, he published this book called The Rise of the Meritocracy. He made the word up, and he worried that no one would take him seriously because the word combines one word with a Latin root and one word with a Greek root. And that was the kind of thing that mid-20th century British academics worried about. Please don't ask me what they are or which way round it is, because my Latin and Greek are not very good. The problem was not that the word wasn't taken seriously. In fact, the opening sentence of Goldman Sachs' mission statement is Goldman Sachs is a meritocracy. You can't open a newspaper without tripping over the word. It is that it was taken the opposite way to the way he meant it. The book is written as a warning. It's a satirical novel. In this novel, it's one of those kind of go-to-the-future novels. A sociologist, also called Michael Young, which gets a bit weird, goes to this society that's become a meritocracy. And in this meritocracy, 4 things happen. 1, the rich pull away from everybody else. Because in a meritocracy, they come to believe they deserve their winnings. After all, I came by them meritoriously. I've worked hard and I'm very smart. How dare you touch my 529 account? It's a meritocracy. And so inequality almost inevitably grows. Because there isn't any sense of guilt or luck, but of merit, grit and hard work. So that's one of the damaging sides. It's one of the differences between the UK and the US. I'm not saying that I'm not going to hold up the UK as this hugely meritocratic society for obvious reasons. But at least in the UK, the posh people have the decency to feel guilty. Some of the time. And you can do a little bit of work with that guilt. Not here. Except that maybe right at the top, the kind of Titans, but not the people who are emailing Chris. My neighbours telling him to kill the 529 account, right? There's no guilt there. So that's the first thing. Second thing that happens is that the people who are left behind in the meritocracy, the people who don't feel that they're succeeding, get increasingly despairing and desperate. Because it's very hard psychologically to be struggling in a society that keeps telling you that it's a meritocracy. Because by definition, that can only mean it's your fault. What we're effectively saying to people who are struggling in a meritocracy is, well, if you were as clever and hardworking as me, you'd be okay. And after a while, that message starts to wear a little bit thin. And it's a deeply harsh society that lacks compassion. Because inevitably you'll have people who are struggling, some people are better at some things than others, etc. But we've turned this idea of meritocracy, especially based on intellectual ability, into a virtual god. And that's a very hard world to live in if you're not one of the people who's either been lucky or fortunate enough to develop those skills. Third thing that happens is, this is all in the novel, third thing that happens, the posh people, the clever people, become obsessed with who they marry and have children with. Because it becomes incredibly important to breed clever children. And so they're getting IQ tests all the time and marrying the right people. And in the US right now, there's been the rise of something called assortative mating. Assortative mating is a sociologist's term for marrying somebody like yourself. It's not a very romantic term. I wouldn't use it on your dating profile. But seeking to assortatively mate with somebody else who also went to a good college. But it is what happens, and in fact it's happening more and more, partly because of the rise of women's education, is that you're seeing now increasing likelihood that someone with a 4-year college education is going to marry someone else with a 4-year college education. And all the way down the distribution. You're seeing less cross-class marriages than we saw in the past, because after all, we need to have clever children, and then we need lots of money to invest in them. The fourth thing that happens is that there is a bloody and violent revolution led by a skilled populist leader 60 years ago. So the other way to think about this is this idea of meritocracy is, I'm going to use this analogy from Bernard Williams, who's another of my favourite British philosophers. And you don't get many mid-20th century British philosophers in this lecture series, I'm guessing. So I'm going to take my chance. Bernard described a society where warriors were inherited. So it was a gendered one too. So I'm using his language. But the sons of warriors became warriors. Just that was how it worked. So it was a hereditary society. And the warriors got all the money, all the food, the best houses, lots of training, etc. And people got fed up with this. So this isn't fair. The people who were just the servants said, I want my kids to have a chance to be warriors. So they said, OK, fine, we'll have a test. We have a meritocratic test. We won't even know who are the sons of the warriors. But it turns out that the warriors, because they're well-trained, well-fed, and been preparing for it since the day they were born, all are better. So they all become warriors anyway. And the reformers protest that equality of opportunity has not really been achieved. The wealthy reply that it has. The poor now have the opportunity of becoming warriors. It's just their bad luck, their characteristics are such they don't pass the test. We are not, they might say, excluding anyone for being poor. We're excluding people for being weak. And it's just unfortunate that those who are poor are also weak. The application of meritocracy, it's hard to think about that as the equivalent today, so it's changing. Now, just replace the words such as, see the charts I just showed you, people protest, we don't really have equality of opportunity. And the rich say, that, yes, you do. The poor have the opportunity of getting good college educations. It's just their bad luck they don't pass the test. We are not, they might say, excluding anyone for being poor. We're excluding people for being dumb. And it's just unfortunate those who are poor are also dumb. Dumb as measured by the meritocratic standards of the selective institutions in question. Right? As they say, that's when meritocracy, vice of meritocracy becomes a problem. So in order to solve some of this, we've got to start really early. And as I say, early years is not really the kind of field that I'm in. But I just thought it would be useful to share some of the evidence. And I'm conscious I do this, that many people in the room will know much more than I do about this. But just a kind of reminder, this is Greg Duncan's work. If people don't know Greg Duncan's work, then it's definitely worth checking out. This is some work he's done, which is just showing literally the size of the brain and how it grows for people of high, middle, and low socioeconomic status across the months, from 5 months onwards. So now with good MRI scanning, so you're actually literally able to see the effect of different status on the growth of the brain in physical. So this is in cubic centimeters, literally an effect on the size of the brain. Now you can imagine what that effect that's going to have going later on in life. So there's this very, very early effect of status and economics on it. And I've done some work saying, just thinking there are like 4 things we might do in the early years: money, pre-K, leave, and parenting. I'm just going to say one thing on each. Again, this is Greg Duncan's work, where he shows, and this thing speaks to the earlier point about early mattering more. All this is doing is showing you the difference that what your parents' income has on your subsequent income, whether based on whether their income was in the early years, the middle years, or the later years. So effectively, all this chart's showing you from that black line is it matters a whole hell of a lot more how rich or poor your parents are when you're young than when you're not. It's dramatic. The impact of parental income on your subsequent outcomes is virtually negligible later on. It's massive in the early years, massive, for reasons that we can obviously speculate about. So give people more money when their kids are very young. Seems to be a pretty sensible policy solution. Secondly, pre-K, early years education, mixed bag at the moment. As many of you all know, the evaluations of Head Start didn't come in where everyone hoped they would. Part of the problem is that we're comparing, these are outcomes, this is percentage point change in a high school graduation rates. Part of the problem is we start with the peri-preschool effect on the right. God, in a way the world would have been better without peri-preschool, because now everything gets compared to peri-preschool. And there's other problems with peri-preschool, but really it's like that sent a benchmark that no one can possibly ever clear. It's like you're constantly competing against an Olympic hurdler or something, right? So, and the Head Start evaluations have actually had not as big an effect as we want. This is Diane Schatzenbach's work. The green one shows the early Head Start, the purple one shows the next Head Start. So really these are effects, but they're not huge, certainly by comparison to peri ones. Interestingly, they vary hugely by race. And what you'll see is that you get quite a good effect from, right in the middle there, which is when your mother didn't finish high school, preschool for you seems to have quite a big effect. It's got a bigger effect for Hispanics. Actually, it's not having a statistically significant effect for Black Americans. So again, you're seeing these kind of big kind of race gaps. I haven't seen a gender breakdown of that, however. But overall, so the picture is a mixed picture. There's a lot to learn, but there are some positive impacts there from early years. I mentioned that I'm a big fan of home visiting. This just shows you some of the impacts on home visiting from a control group and a treatment group of using community resources, overnights, and number of emergency medical care episodes. And those don't look like big effects, but they're all significant. And in aggregate, they are actually quite big effects. And then you're seeing other effects too. What I also like about home visiting is being so well evaluated so far. So we're seeing evidence-based policy making. What we usually get is policy-based evidence making. I'm sure you've all seen that. In fact, you get more of that than the other kind. Here's a policy, show me some evidence it's working. And then lastly, I'm on the Brookings AEI working group on paid leave. The US is the only advanced country in the world that doesn't have universal paid leave. This is showing maternity leave and how many months of paid and unpaid you get in different countries. So some time with kids would be good too. I'm going to finish though with the bit where we cheat, the upper middle class cheat. So I want to invest early. I want to try and break this idea of meritocracy all the way through. The earlier we start, the better, as you've said. Because one of the ways that we win, the upper middle class win, is through the development of human capital right from the beginning, from zero or even earlier. And as I said, there's these huge differences in levels of family stability as well. There's no retreat from marriage, for example, in the American upper middle class. None whatsoever. So marriage is strengthening at the top of the education distribution in the US. That is not true everywhere. That's not true lower down. So there's a huge marriage gap, interestingly, in the US too. But we're not content to leave it at that. We also do a little bit of cheating. We rig a few markets in our favor. I define opportunity hoarding as basically taking a valuable opportunity that is definitionally scarce and then allocated in a way that's basically unfair. That has nothing to do with the individual in question. I have 3 examples: exclusionary zoning around affluent neighborhoods and good school districts. So housing, land, legacy admissions for some colleges, and internships. The cost of housing in the US is growing pretty rapidly. This is rents, the same prices compared to average incomes. So for middle class and poorer families, the cost of housing is becoming a bigger and bigger issue, especially in the places where the jobs are. That's partly because land is getting more expensive, and that's because we're over-regulating land. It's because there's too much local zoning, there's too much NIMBYism, there's too much protectionism among those who are doing well and in affluent neighborhoods against the idea that people of lower income might become their neighbors and might send their kids to the same schools as their kids. And that's when the rubber really hits the road. There are many people who are willing to vote the right way and put the right posters on their lawns, etc., and have all the right political opinions, but who might not be there when the vote comes on the housing rezoning, who might not be there at the school district when they're deciding whether to integrate the schools, because all of a sudden it gets personal then. But it seems to me that the depersonalization of inequality won't do anymore. We are embedded in this. We're in the thick of it whether we like it or not. And so housing just gives me one good example of that. There's been a massive increase in land use regulation, which is what this shows. There's a number of court cases over time with land use regulation. Legacy preferences. This isn't going to be too much fun here. This is great fun when I go to elite universities who operate a hereditary principle in their college admissions, which I did a couple of times last week. It's great fun because the US is the only country in the world that does it. It's embarrassing, it's outrageous. Can't believe you still do it. These are the admissions rates for people with legacies and non-legacies to get into these elite colleges. I'll move on, otherwise we're going to be here all night. What are we doing? And by the way, this won't survive anyway. Legacies will go at some point. And then internships, which I think is in some ways kind of more important because almost all of us are in institutions that might have internship opportunities or work experience opportunities of one kind or another. How they're allocated, who they go to is hugely important. This is a survey of employers asking them, this is for college graduates, but it's true for others too, how important is internships to you? And internships now comes top of a survey of HR managers involved in recruitment when they're selecting candidates. Half the internships in the US are unpaid. Approximately the same number are allocated through social networks on the basis of who you know, and not generally in a good way, generally in a bad way. They go to people who you know, and so the cycle repeats itself. Internships are an important labor market institution. Many of us have some control over their internships or other work opportunities in our institutions, neighborhoods, schools, etc. That's an intentional area of policy which we can do something about. And again, it gets quite personal. So my son asked me if I would help him get an internship. This is before I'd written the book. No, absolutely not. I'm not using my position to help you get an internship. My friends then just said, oh, don't worry, we'll help you. Thereby completely, so I didn't let them do that. But my final point is almost where I began, which is that we do need, I think, to bring about all these policies. I have lots of policy ideas, some of which I've talked about here. You'll have them too. The problem we have is not a lack of policy ideas. The problem we have is a lack of a political culture within which those policy ideas can be funded and enacted and sustained. Culture precedes politics, and politics precedes policy. And as I work in a policy think tank, this is painful for me to say. But the problem isn't that we haven't got the right policies. And it isn't as if we come up with the right policy and the right policy paper and the right cost-benefit analysis, that miraculously legislators will run gratefully away with it, raise the money through fair taxation and enact the policy. No. They are trapped within political incentives, as Chris Van Hollen and Nancy Pelosi realized. And that's where we come in, because culture and a sense of are we willing to give and give up becomes hugely important too, because what we need to arrest some of the challenges that I've just outlined is nothing short of a new progressive era in our politics and in our policy. And I say that in a genuinely non-partisan way. I mean progressive in the sense of making the investments in equality of opportunity and moving forward. But that requires a shift of reform. So I read Richard Hofstadter, who's a great historian, and he wrote this book about the age of reform, which was about the progressive era. And this really struck me, what he said about it. This is a big theme in his book. So the progressive era is what gave rise to the universal the high school movement, many of the kind of beginnings of a welfare state, and more progressive taxation. And he said the moral indignation of the age, the progressive era, was by no means directed entirely against others. I'll pause there, because right now the moral indignation of the age is always directed against others. The others vary, depending on your political persuasions. It's the top 1% or the Trump voters or the immigrants or the women or the people of color or the whatever. But it's always somebody else, or the welfare dependents. It's always someone else. Contrast, hint, it was in great and critical measure directed inward. Contemporaries who spoke of the movement as an affair of the conscience were not mistaken. And I've come reluctantly and slowly to the belief that we'll only get the kinds of policy changes that we need, the kind of investments we need to make equality of opportunity a reality, if there is an affair of the conscience among those with the power and the money and the influence to change the structures that are serving them, and by them I mean us, very well, and leaving so many others behind. So this has now become not just a technocratic problem or a moral problem or even a political problem, but quite a deep moral problem. And it therefore has to be addressed at a moral level as well as at a policy level. Thank you for your attention. Yeah, I'm happy to do that. Yeah, I can handle it. Who has questions? Hands up, particularly if you disagree. Yes. The lady in the room. Right. There's a microphone coming, apparently.
Good evening. Thank you for a very interesting presentation.
Thank you.
When you talk about black boys not being employed, who is not hiring? And when you talk about black boys, are you talking about children or are you talking about black men?
So I'm talking about, thank you for the question. I'm talking about black boys who become black men.
Okay.
But what I'm saying is I'm just sharing the fact that for boys who are black who come from low-income households, so that maybe that bottom 20%, their chances of rising out of that low-income household are extremely low. In fact, less than 50%. So we knew already that there was a huge race gap in upward mobility. What we now know is that there's a gender gap within the race gap. So for example, for black women and white women who are from the bottom 20% of the income distribution, their earnings now, going forward, their adult earnings are about the same. So black women from poor backgrounds are earning about as much as white women from poor backgrounds now. Now, there are a lot more black women from poor backgrounds, okay? So that doesn't affect that's just, comparing one to the other. But it's not true for men. White men from poor backgrounds earn much more than black men from poor backgrounds. So there's something very specific going on here, which has to be looked at by place, race, and gender. Incarceration is part of the story, for sure, but you can predict incarceration too, from where boys are at the age of 12 sometimes. So I think there's a whole series of segregations within segregations, and something quite peculiar is happening to black boys, which I think, as a British white man, I'm not an expert, to say the least, okay? But it also gives me a little bit of license, I think, to suggest that, and some reading around this, is that, particularly at this moment where gender is so salient in our politics, we shouldn't make the mistake of thinking that it's the same to be a man if you're black as it is to be a man if you're white. And some growing evidence that it is actually a disadvantage to be a man if you're black compared to being white. And even to some extent.
So how would you see white privilege coming into the equation and merit has nothing to do with it? Example that you used with your son. If my son was going up for an internship and yours was too, like you said, your friends would help them. So in the
I wouldn't let them help him, but yeah.
Yeah, but my point is, we have to also look at, in this country, there has been some preferential treatment given, and it has nothing to do with merit.
Sure.
It has nothing to do with your brain size. It has nothing to do with being clever. So that's part of an equation that we cannot measure, but it is part of some people's lives. Thank you very much.
I completely agree with you. All I'll say is that I'm increasingly convinced by the evidence that the unconscious bias against black men is now significantly greater than the unconscious bias against black women, which is not to say that the unconscious bias against black women has gone. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying. Please don't think I'm saying that. I'm just saying it does seem as if when an employer is making a decision, you're absolutely right. You put your son against my son, white privilege will come into play. But if you put a black woman and a black man into the same thing, it looks as if employers are much less likely to take the black man, everything else equal, than the black woman. Why that is another matter. But you can also see it, by the way. You can see it in colleges. You can see it in the labour market. You can see it in employment patterns now, that whilst we're still a long way to go, black women are beginning to move ahead in a way they previously weren't. It's just not true of black men. Black men aren't. So, sorry. I really should put my phone on silent. Could you all put your phone on silent? It's very rude. Okay, yes, anybody else? Yes, then put it back.
Thank you so much for speaking with us. I wonder if you have any more on the place in terms of, think of these elite higher institutions or even four-year institutions where, Harvard's sitting on top of a $40 billion endowment and you get all the centers built there and you're not getting that investment in other parts of the country. Have you looked into that at all in terms of place?
Place. Well, so there's two things going on there. I think you're talking about place and the institutions in the place. So you might be talking about Harvard, you could be talking about Hopkins, for example. And the role of institutions, particularly elite or relatively powerful institutions, particularly in places that are relatively poor, economically speaking anyway. University of Chicago is another good example of that. So I would say, the first thing to say is that I actually supported the Trump administration's tax on the endowments of the elite colleges. I think the fact they're tax-free is unfair. And I'll give you an example of how unfair it is. There's something called trade adjustment assistance, which is federal spending to help people who are affected by trade policy. For every dollar we spend on that, we spend $25 subsidizing the endowments of elite universities. So I supported that. I think they should be able to lower the tax by taking more people. But actually, I think that the velvet glove treatment that is handed out to those elite institutions is absolutely outrageous. And I think there's justifiable anger about that, when many of our community colleges are seeing their budgets squeezed very hard indeed as a result of cuts. And so, for every $400 million that someone gives to Harvard, just think what you could do with that in the institutions that are serving actual Americans that most need it. I would mind less if they weren't so elite in their composition, but those institutions are entirely elite in their composition. They will brandish the fact they're getting a bit better in terms of Pell-eligible students, but really, they're upper middle class reproduction machines, those institutions. They absolutely are. And then to get a massive tax break for doing that, I don't think, regardless of your political position, and interestingly, the Obama administration considered doing something on endowment tax, waved away, because it was quite a professorial administration. It's full of Ivy League professors. I don't want to be personal about it, but there was no way that a liberal Democrat was going to hit the Ivy League. It took Trump to hit the Ivy League colleges, right? Because it became good politics for him, because of his base. I do think, though, that now that we know much more about how places matter, it means that anchor institutions in those places need to think much harder about what their role in those places is. Because otherwise you get these kind of fortress universities, effectively, where kind of upper middle class students and faculty parachute in and out, but they're very disconnected from the communities in which they sit. And I'm really impressed with the way that some of the universities are thinking harder about that. Chicago being, I think, top of the list. Yes, the gentleman.
Thank you for a magnificent talk. Really learnt a lot.
Okay, you can stop there if you like.
That's all I wanted to say, actually.
Next.
That's all I actually wanted to say. Thank you. You present a very convincing argument, but you start off by blowing off the notion of the importance of the 1%, and you make quite a thing about it. Yeah. Most of the data you're describing is really association type of data, and we don't get to understand why these things are happening.
Yep.
And you talk about the upper middle class feeling poor.
Yep.
Is that, I just ask, is that a consequence of the growth of the 1%, and is that a factor that's affecting the culture, that's ultimately affecting the factors that you're saying?
Yes, I do think that's right. So, and you're right to say that I pushed quite hard against that framing, the 1% framing. And candidly, that's partly because that felt like the dominant framing. And so I think I wanted to interrupt it because it was just being too easily accepted. And one of the reasons I interrupted, not just because I thought it was empirically not quite right, although I don't think it's the whole story of inequality empirically, but also because I was really troubled by the consequences of it, because it was allowing people who are merely in the top 20% or top 10% to convince themselves that they were a struggling member of the American middle class, like everybody else. And so I actually thought it was becoming quite regressive in its effects. Now, you might say it's a natural thing to always look up and compare yourself to people who are richer than you, okay? It's all relative. It's a question relative to whom. And so there is a plausible argument, which I think you're making, that if I wasn't so angry about how rich my neighbors are, maybe I would be more compassionate about the fact that I'm maybe. But it's an indirect way to get at it. So if we're saying, well, I have to. by the way, I think we should clobber the 10%, the top 1% very, very hard indeed. I think we should pay a lot more tax, and almost everything I propose would hit the 1% pretty hard. Right? All these tax breaks that benefit the top 20%, they benefit the top 1% even harder, and a lot of the legacies are top 1%. I was at Washington University last week. 24% of their students are from the top 1% of the distribution, 1 in 4, and 84% of their students are from the top 20%. So, and a lot of those top 1% are legacies. And so a lot of those things, so actually kind of smuggling into my upper middle class, I've actually got a thing about the 1%, but it's just not enough. And I don't want to let us off the hook. I don't want to let the people who aren't in the top 1% off the hook. That's really my motivation here. Yes? Yes, one over there.
Thank you. I'd like to make sure I understand your point about pre-K. In the collection of slides when you were talking about starting early, you had, on the one hand, you had preschool, which I believe you said had set an artificially high bar, and then you talked about the Head Start study, which, by the way, I have some serious problems with. I think, for one thing, it was based on third grade reading scores. There's a lot more to life than third grade reading scores. Head Start has tremendous outcomes for later life.
As did Perry. I mean, sometimes you have to wait, so-called sleeper effects.
Absolutely. So I guess my question is, between those two, where would you find the value of pre-K, and how would you put some quantification on that? Okay, well, it's a great question.
I think it's a really interesting area of scholarship at the moment. I mean, you see some very thoughtful people with somewhat different views about how effective pre-K is proving to be, and many of them are actually within 30 yards of where I sit. There are huge debates kind of within Brookings about this. I would characterize my position right now as I do think Perry pre-K set an artificially high bar, and what it did was it therefore created a sense of early years determinism. It was a sense of it's all over by 5, and I think we all agree it's important by 5, but there was this moment where it was just almost game over at 5, and that's not right. So I think it had that effect. And in fact, I was at an event with Jim Heckman, who famously did the Perry preschool thing, and he got quite agitated at one point. He said, I'm really worried now that everyone's just obsessed with the early years, and they're not worrying enough about adolescence. And I thought, whose fault is that? Because he genuinely thinks, actually, there's still a lot you can do in adolescence as well. So I do think there was a kind of moment in kind of policy history, if you like, where we just put too much weight on what we thought pre-K could achieve. And having set such a high bar politically, it then almost set us up for some disappointment if actually just turned out to work sometimes, better for some people than others, a lot to learn, etc. In other words, just be an ordinary area of policy as opposed to this magical intervention everyone could be in favour of. The other thing is, pre-K needs to be paid for, but it doesn't tend to have visceral, vicious opponents, which means that it's ripe for bipartisanship and for a lot of people to say this is great. So the political costs of supporting pre-K are much lower than other things, like integrating K-12 schools or radically reforming higher education funding, for example, because there are losers, there are vested interests. There aren't huge vested interests lined up against pre-K. You might think it's not good or bad, but who's really against it, right? You'll often get chambers of commerce being in favour of it too, for example. So for all those reasons, we have to tread carefully. My position is the evidence thus far is mixed. So if you look at the Tennessee results, not where I think a lot of people hope they would be. You look at some of the Head Start and agree it's early, you have to wait, and not where a lot of people kind of... But that doesn't mean there's nothing there, and there are differences, etc. I would say that we're in a good place now between the people who thought it was going to solve everything, and then the people who thought, no, this is a waste of money, you should do something else, which is somewhere in that kind of middle space. So I'm cautiously optimistic that as the evidence comes in from people like Greg Duncan and others, that the value of high quality pre-K, will become clearer. And we will get better at learning how to replicate high quality pre-K than we are now. So we should definitely kind of keep going with it. I would say, however, that the evidence for things like home visiting is as strong, in my view, as for the evidence around pre-K. So we shouldn't just think of early years and pre-K, we should think of all kinds of other things, because pre-K is quite late. We should think about pre-pre-K as well as pre-K. Clearly a home visiting caucus in the crowd. I didn't know they were here, honestly.
It's pre-pre-K.
Pre-pre-K, sorry, pre-pre-K. Has someone already got a microphone? If not, then this. I'll just start with the gentleman there, if you don't mind, because he's already got the mic, and then I'll come to you. Yeah.
Thank you. So I recently read Fishkin's book on bottlenecks, and one of the cases he makes is certainly that all this early childhood is important, but there are so many bottlenecks along the way that you can't really expect these kids, even through getting through that experience, to catch up or to achieve the goals. And I think you've made that case too, because having wealthy parents and having parents who are educated and so on are some of the other competitive advantages. And you've told us some of the things not to do, 529 programs, endowment that's tax-free. What else are you looking at that you think would help close the gap between kids who have gotten pre-K and even home visiting and then those who are transitioning well into successful, flourishing lives, as Fishkin calls them.
So I do have a chapter on policies, but it's not a very good chapter. It was obligatory. It's a Brookings Institution press book. Think tank. You have to have your policies. I stand by it, I'm proud of it. But someone actually, in a review of the book, someone said this is basically a moral book, thinly disguised as a policy pamphlet. There's the nicest thing anyone could have said about it, especially the thinly disguised bit. So I will share some of that. First of all, by saying I think Bottlenecks is a terrific book. I'm thrilled you've read it. I make every incoming research assistant in my shop read that book. There are 2 books I make them read. I make them read Bottlenecks, and I make them read How to Write Short by Eric Schock, which is great. This is a fantastic book too. And in fact, I did a whole series on Bottlenecks when it came out with Fishkin. The irony, of course, is that he's the son of a very famous philosopher who has gone on to be a very famous philosopher. But it is nonetheless a fantastic book, and it makes the point that you make, which is that that there isn't a single moment where you can create this sort of fair start, whether that's at 0 or 3 or 5 or 12 or 18. There's no moment where you can say, okay, now we can have a fair competition, because every opportunity leads to another opportunity, which leads to another opportunity. You get cumulative opportunity, and then you develop potential, which gives you a chance to get the next opportunity. And so it's a very, very powerful, and you do, as you say, get these bottlenecks that you've got to get through in order to get to the next place. Where are those bottlenecks? Well, just in the interest of time, I'll focus on a couple of things that I do mention in the book, one of which I've alluded to, which is the issue of access to family health and family planning in particular. The very big differences in the ability to make the decisions around parenting, when to have children, at what stage, etc., are huge in the US. They're growing, such that now the age distribution of first-time motherhood is now binomial. Used to be a normal distribution, now binomial, because there's 2 bumps in the distribution, because college-educated women are having their kids so late, and non-college educated women continue to have their kids quite early. So distribution now goes like that. It's quite extraordinary what's happened to that chart. And so that kind of huge difference in just the very beginning. 50% of the births to non-college educated women in the US now are outside marriage. Leave aside, I'm a recovering European liberal, so don't get me wrong about this. But that's 6% for college educated women. 6% of the births to college educated women outside marriage, 50% to non-college educated. That is a massive class gap. Whatever you think about the importance of different kinds of, and it's not about marriage, it's about the stability that the kids have, right? So for goodness sake, why don't we have universal free access to decent quality contraception? I mean, if you're looking for one policy that just, now I don't know why, but, right, so I start with that, right? And I was Bell Saw held a book about it. I go hard on home visiting. I do mention pre-K, but I'm I'm a pre-K person, if I'm honest. And it's so in the culture in Europe where I come from. And I do some stuff in K-12. I do the stuff we not get rid of. And I call for a dramatic redistribution of resources in post-secondary education, where I think the rubber really hits the road. And in particular, some of the stuff we've talked about. But I think we need massive, massive investment in our community colleges and 4-year public universities. And we can afford it by just stopping doling all this money out to the elite colleges. Higher education in the US has become a class stratifier rather than a class reducer. And so we need something. So I use 529s as a way into it, but I need to persuade upper middle class people that their universities need to lose all the tax breaks on alumni giving, all the endowment tax breaks, and legacy. If I can't persuade them on 529s, I've got no chance of persuading on the rest. We have a long way to go. But colleges, wow, and community colleges in particular, those people in community colleges, there's huge variation in outcomes. But I tell you what, to be unscholarly for a moment, those people are doing God's work. They are the ones who are open access, treating the kids that are walking through the door, and that is the tough stuff. That is teaching at bloody Georgetown or University of Maryland. That's not God's work. Teaching in community colleges is. Yes.
I don't think you have a chart for this, but could you say a little bit more about what you mean by an affair of conscience?
I definitely don't have a chart for that. You're right. But thank you for that question. It's a really, really good question. I think I'm into is a sort of awakening I know that has sort of religious connotations, particularly in the US context, but I definitely don't mind that in this case, to the plight of people well outside of our own orbits. Because of segregation and inequality, what's happening is that our immediate contact, that's maybe less true of people in this room, given the nature of this audience, but it's definitely true of a lot of people, with those who are in a very different position. And that has all kinds of problems. One, it changes our reference point, back to the earlier question, which is you compare yourself to people you know. Well, if you only know people who are like you, then of course you feel poor. So that's a kind of big problem. It's something to get away from almost the micro-tribalism I think we're seeing around class, around neighbors, around race. Instead, I see it kind of shrinking slightly shrinking into almost sort of sub-nationalism. So there's a lot of talk about nationalism at the moment, but it's almost like you see it on the coast in class, in certain parts of cities kind of breaking. And so it's really just an awakening to the real needs that lie beyond our immediate horizons and a willingness to give up. I'm asking for sacrifice. I'm asking for us to, at some level, look inside ourselves and say, this needs to hurt a little bit. I need to give up a bit more if we're serious about it. That's meant by conscience, the awakening of it. This is not just an issue of win-win. So I think the difference would be between my argument, which is appeal to a conscience, is very different to the classic argument, which would be a win-win. If we invest in pre-K, everyone will get richer. We'll have fewer criminals. You should vote for pre-K. You'll be a winner too. Fine. It's a perfectly good argument. Many of you probably make that argument. I don't mean to be as disparaging as I sound. But at some point, we have to say not everyone always wins all the time. Sometimes we might have to give up a little bit. You know, maybe my neighbourhood will have to be a bit more mixed. My school will have to be a bit more mixed. I'm going to be a little bit poorer. I'm going to give some actual stuff up. And that requires conscience rather than a cost-benefit analysis. And that's the really difficult bit to kind of get across. And that's the difference between the creation of a progressive era and a technocratic era. And I think for the last, goodness knows how long, of progressive politics has been very technocratic, very win-win, very much a kind of don't worry, don't trouble, very much like we don't have to give too much up. And it's not deep enough. We've got to go deeper. It's going to be much, much harder than we thought it was going to be, and it's going to require here. I'm saying this as a Brookings scholar. I make a living here, but it's got to come from here. I'll probably be out of a job soon. You're not webcasting this, are you? It's not live, is it? Policies really matter. It's all about intellect. Let's do some more cost benefit. Yeah, I actually have written about this. I think that the idea of relational equality, which I believe is founded on mutual respect, is what we need. And I've been writing a bit about this recently and talking a bit about this. Actually, we talk about resource inequality, we talk about rights inequality, and those are very important kinds of inequality. But in the end, real equality comes from respect. And I quote this philosopher, Philip Pettit, who says, a truly equal society in that relational sense is one where everybody can look each other squarely in the eye. Look each other squarely in the eye. That sounds a bit weird, but think about that for a moment. There's an incredible egalitarianism in the fact that you're doing that. That's why, until relatively recently, black Americans couldn't do it to white Americans without all kinds of physical risks, precisely because it would signify equal status. You're supposed to lower your eyes in deference if you're of lesser status. Women in many parts of the world today can't look me squarely. It wouldn't be. So you think about that idea, you're supposed to lower your eyes rather than. And similarly, if you look down your nose at someone, we look down at someone. Think about those phrases for a bit and actually think that the disrespect that's been shown across race lines in the US remains and is actually being fanned by some of our politicians deliberately. But I also think there's something to be said for a certain disrespect across class lines too, partly because of this insidious meritocratic idea. There's a bit of looking down our noses at people who just haven't quite made it as well as we have too. And so the combination of those, we need more respect to get more relational equality. That's why it is an affair of the conscience. So. Thank you for the question. Yes.
Well, good evening.
Yes.
Even though we're here talking about preschool children, we're talking about early childhood education. For the last 6 months, I've been involved with Southwest Partnership in an arena that's called Dreams Deferred. 50 years later, here we are from Martin Luther King. And we're looking at the 21st century school. And the 21st century school is a place that's supposed to house all the ideal situations that would make a school and the community successful. The question was asked at University of Baltimore, do our schools need to change to fit our communities, or do our communities need to change to fit our schools? And each speaker had to take a stance as to what they thought. Mine was a mix. I think both needs to take place. And as you stated, it's about relationship. I know at the at Maryland State Department of Education, some of the things that we used to look at concerning preschool children, and it always focuses on, or seemed to be pointed towards, the black males, the African American males. And it seems to be that the African American males have a different type of learning style that has been set up or perpetuated in a culture that doesn't really fit them. So the respect for me comes to say, okay, they're more kinesthetic, they're more adventurous, they're more able to move around, but then ADHD takes place. So then they want to put them on medication.
Are you talking about boys generally
I'm
now?
talking about boys.
Or black boys specifically?
Black boys. Black boys.
Okay.
Black boys. And prisons seem to be built based upon the test scores by the 4th grade of African American boys. How many prisons will we build?
Yeah.
How will they be housed? So we've been thrust into a culture that seems to be very biased and don't know that they're biased or racist. Because I'll say you're racist by nature and you don't know you're racist. Okay, but in all actuality, we still work with families, we work with children. And we know there's a cultural difference when it comes to socio-economical groups. But it shouldn't be one that divides what a child receives when they come in, or how we look at them because they have a different learning style, or they're coming from a different type of home, or coming from a different neighborhood. I came through Towson State University, and the school there was a school where we did home visits. We went to home visits, but a lot of the children at the school made more money than the teachers did, who came from cultures that would fly to Mexico or do different things. The same way with us here in this room is a different class set of people here, different values, different norms, but we all come together. But the true part is that we all don't receive the same fairness, even when it comes to Baltimore City. We don't receive, even as a black African-American woman, I don't receive a lot of things that a lot of the white women may receive in different arenas, and that's a fact. And it's done by design. Maybe it's not done intentionally, but it's done by design. So we need to look at where we are in this room with a culture and race of people to say, are we being fair to one another? Because we're not being fair to one another, even in this arena. So how can we be fair to children and families when we can't be fair to one another as adults?
Thank you. So I don't think I can respond fully to that, but I appreciated every word of it. I will respond to a couple of points. One, the point about schools and the people who are going into the schools and who they're designed for, who they're ready for. You know, I have 3 sons, and a lot of what you just said you thought was characteristic of black boys, I think is characteristic more generally of boys. I think that there is an intersection between race and gender that we're only at the beginnings as social scientists of even getting the data on. But I think a lot of people who are closer to it understand. I think you intuitively understand, which is that whilst a lot of these issues affect boys, it might affect black boys differently because they're black boys, not just boys. Right. So I hear that. And actually, Sarah Goldrick-Rabb, who's a very good scholar on college work, she's now pushing the idea of thinking about who we take as institutions. So it really struck me. We're used to talking about school readiness and college readiness, college preparedness. We talk about the school-ready kid, the student, and she's turned it on her head for colleges and said, actually, you need to be a student-ready college. And what she means by that is you're going to get all kinds of kids coming, right? Especially if you're more open access. And so it's a really nice, I haven't fully thought it through, a really nice rebalancing of that, which is that, particularly as a public access, particularly a public school, the idea that all we need to do is get every single individual to be school ready, and then the school can wash its hands and say, great, finally you've done your job, I can do mine. It's for the birds. Actually, you've got to think about actually being a student-ready school. And that means students, wherever they're coming from and whatever they need. It's much more radical. And that's a challenge to a lot of institutions and teachers, actually, because very often that's not, it's very easy to say, well, how can I deal with this? I'm just a teacher. I just want to teach them, but they're not ready. So I think that's the first point. That's a helpful thing around schools. And the last point I'll make is in response to where you ended. Obviously, I don't know about the particular dynamics within a particular group, within a particular city. You referred to the treatment of black women as opposed to white women, even within a group such as this. What I do appreciate is the honesty of the question, because I very strongly believe, and here I'm going to quote another philosopher, Jerry Cohen, who said that social justice isn't just found in institutions and rules. It's found in the thick of daily life. In the thick of daily life. From where we stand, in our shoes and in our institutions. And so how we interact with each other with respect, in terms of how we think about our neighborhoods, in the thick of daily life, in the interactions we have right here, in this room, this evening, tomorrow, or in our institutions, that's where the hard work begins. That's not a substitute for structural reform or institutional reform, but it is necessary. It's a prerequisite for it. We cannot subcontract our progressivism or our liberalism or our views about society to rules and institutions and votes. It's also where we stand in the thick of daily life. And so I really appreciate you putting it that way. Thank you for the question. And I think with that,
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Reeves. You've given us some wonderful thoughts and ideas to go home with. I want to thank the audience, especially those of you who asked such wonderful questions. And we do this Sandra J. Skolnik Lecture once a year, and we hope we will see you next year. Thank you all for coming.